When my grandmother was dying, she whispered something that changed everything I thought I knew about her. The embroidery in the wooden chest, it's not what you think it is. What I discovered in that chest would save my daughter's life and reveal a family secret that had been hidden for over a century. Subscribe to our channel to hear stories that prove miracles still happen in ordinary homes, stitched together by faith and love that transcends generations. Have you ever discovered that something simple in your childhood held the power to change everything? Some memories cling to your soul like morning frost on window panes, beautiful and impossible to forget. Mine is the soft click of Grandma Evelyn's silver thimble against her embroidery hoop, mixed with the sweet scent of honeysuckle drifting through the screen door of her farmhouse in Cedar Springs, Tennessee. When my grandmother was dying, she whispered something that changed everything I thought I knew about her. The embroidery in the wooden chest, it's not what you think it is. What I discovered in that chest would save my daughter's life and reveal a family secret that had been hidden for over a century. Subscribe to our channel to hear stories that prove miracles still happen in ordinary homes, stitched together by faith and love that transcends generations. Have you ever discovered that something simple in your childhood held the power to change everything? Some memories cling to your soul like morning frost on window panes, beautiful and impossible to forget. Mine is the soft click of Grandma Evelyn's silver thimble against her embroidery hoop, mixed with the sweet scent of honeysuckle drifting through the screen door of her farmhouse in Cedar Springs, Tennessee. It was the summer of 1985. I was 8 years old, and I spent every July and August at Grandma's place while my parents worked double shifts at the textile mill. Her house was one of those old white clapboard farmhouses with a wraparound porch, creaky wooden floors, and windows that let in more breeze than light. Grandma Evelyn was 74 that summer. With silver hair she always wore in a simple braid down her back, and hands that seemed to hold magic in their fingertips. Every afternoon, after the lunch dishes were dried and put away, she'd settle into her favorite rocking chair on the front porch with her embroidery hoop. But here's what puzzled me then and haunts me now. Grandma Evelyn never finished a single piece. She would start each embroidery with such care, such devotion, small wildflowers that she called prairie roses, delicate blooms that required. I'd sit cross-legged on the porch floor, playing with the old wooden blocks Grandpa Thomas had carved for me before he passed. But my eyes were always drawn to those graceful hands, working their quiet magic. Sometimes Grandma would hum old hymns while she stitched. Amazing Grace, How Great Thou Art, songs that seemed to weave themselves into the fabric along with her thread. Her voice was soft and weathered, like old velvet worn smooth by time, but it carried a strength that could calm any storm in my 8-year-old heart. Then came the part that never made sense to me. Just when a piece was nearly complete, just when those prairie roses were about to bloom fully on the white cotton, Grandma would set down her hoop, pick up her tiny scissors, and carefully undo every single stitch, thread by thread. It was a Thursday afternoon. I remember because that was the day Grandma made her famous buttermilk biscuits. When I finally asked the question burning in my chest, "Grandma Evelyn, why don't you ever finish your embroidery?" She paused, her needle suspended in mid-air, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Something between sadness and ancient wisdom. "Come here, child," she said, patting the wooden stool beside her chair. "Sit with me a spell." I scrambled up from the floor and perched on that familiar stool, worn smooth by generations of children who had sat there before me. "Look real close at this embroidery," she said, holding the hoop toward me. "What do you see?" "I see prairie roses, Grandma." "Look closer, sweetheart. Look at the petals." I leaned in until I could smell the lavender sachets tucked in her sewing basket. That's when I saw it. The petals weren't random shapes at all. Each one was carefully formed into letters. My heart started beating faster as the letters came into focus. E-M-M-A, my name, stitched into the petals of a flower so delicate, it looked like it might blow away in the summer breeze. "This rose has your name in it, Emma. And this one over here has your brother Jake's name. And this little bud starting to form, that's for your cousin Timothy." I felt goosebumps rise on my arms despite the warm afternoon air. "But why, Grandma? Why put our names in flowers?" She set the hoop in her lap and took my small hands in her weathered ones. "Because every stitch I make is a prayer I say for you, child. Every thread that goes through this fabric carries my love and my hopes straight up to heaven. As long as I keep stitching your names, you're safe." "Safe from what?" Grandma Evelyn's eyes grew distant, looking out over the cornfields that stretched to the horizon. "From everything that can hurt a child in this world, sweetheart. Sickness, accidents, heartbreak, fear. A grandmother's job is to stand between her grandchildren and anything that might harm them." Do you remember the moment you realized that someone loved you more than their own life? But why do you take it all apart when it's almost done? That's when she said the words that would echo in my mind for the next 40 years. "Child, this embroidery isn't meant to be finished. It's meant to last. If I finish it, the prayer stops. But if I keep stitching and unstitching, the prayer never ends." I didn't understand it then, but I felt the truth of it deep in my bones. There was something sacred happening on that porch, something that went far beyond needle and thread. As the years passed and I grew from a curious child into a questioning teenager, I began to notice other things about Grandma's embroidery that had escaped my younger eyes. She kept a small leather journal beside her sewing basket, a book with pages yellow and soft as butter from decades of handling. I never saw her write in it during the day, but sometimes in the early morning, before the rest of the world woke up, I'd catch glimpses of her making tiny notations by lamplight. Have you ever felt like there were secrets moving through your house, just beyond your understanding? One summer morning when I was 15, I woke early and found Grandma on the porch, writing in that mysterious journal. The moment she saw me, she closed it quickly and tucked it away. "Morning, child," she said with a smile. But I caught something in her eyes, a flicker of someone keeping a sacred trust. "Why that color for lost people, Grandma?" I asked one autumn afternoon. "Because folks who are lost need to remember that there's always a path back to love," she said, her needle never pausing in its gentle rhythm. "And forests always have paths, even when we can't see them right away." That's when I began to understand that I wasn't just watching an old woman embroider. I was witnessing something ancient and powerful, a tradition that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that love could be sewn into fabric, that prayers could be stitched with thread, that protection could be woven by patient hands. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that this beautiful tradition would soon face its greatest test, and that the faith stitched into those unfinished flowers would be the only thing standing between my family and heartbreak. Have you ever realized that the most powerful things in your life were hiding in plain sight? By the time I turned 22, I thought I understood Grandma Evelyn's embroidery ritual. I was wrong. The truth was far more mysterious and powerful than I could have imagined. It started when I got married and moved to Nashville, about 2 hours away from Cedar Springs. Every time I visited home, I'd find Grandma in her usual spot on the porch, stitching the same eternal prairie roses, humming the same gentle hymns. But now I noticed something different in her eyes when she looked at me, a deep satisfaction, as if something important had been accomplished. "Grandma," I said during one visit, "you look like the cat that ate the canary. What's got you so pleased?" She smiled that secret smile I'd seen so many times before. "Oh, nothing much, child. Just happy to see my Emma settled and content." But it wasn't nothing. Over the next few years, as my brothers and cousins got married, started careers, and began their own families, I began to notice a pattern that sent chills down my spine. Have you ever realized that coincidences might not be coincidences at all? My brother Jake, for instance, he'd always been reckless, the kind of boy who climbed too high, drove too fast, and never met a dare he wouldn't take. In high school, he wrecked 3 motorcycles, broke his arm twice, and somehow always walked away from situations that should have seriously hurt him. One night when he was 17, he was driving home from a party when his truck hit a patch of black ice on the mountain road. The truck flipped twice and landed upside down in a ravine. The paramedics said it was a miracle he survived with just a few scratches. At the time, we thanked God and counted our blessings. But now, years later, I remembered something. The week before Jake's accident, I'd seen Grandma working on her embroidery with unusual intensity, using pure white thread and a stitch pattern I'd never seen before. When I asked her about it, she'd simply said, "Sometimes a grandmother just knows when extra protection is needed." Then there was my cousin Rebecca. She'd struggled with depression since her teenage years, had attempted suicide twice, and seemed to carry a darkness that no amount of love from our family could lift. For years, we watched helplessly as she drifted from one crisis to another. But something changed when Rebecca was 25. She met a kind man at church, found a job she loved at the local animal shelter, and slowly began to emerge from the shadow that had followed her for so long. Today, she's the strange thing. I remember Grandma spending an entire winter embroidering with that deep forest green thread she used for lost people, working with a dedication that bordered on obsession. Coincidence? Maybe. But when the same pattern repeated with every member of our family, I began to suspect that Grandma Evelyn's unfinished embroidery was more than just a harmless ritual. Do you believe that love can create its own kind of miracles? The suspicion became certainty the summer my daughter Sarah was born. I brought her to Cedar Springs when she was just 3 weeks old, a tiny bundle of perfection that made my heart ache with love and fear in equal measure. Grandma Evelyn, now 86 and moving more slowly, but with her mind still sharp as a tack, held Sarah for the first time with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "She's perfect, Emma. Just perfect." That evening, I found Grandma on the porch with her embroidery, but this time she was working with thread I'd never seen before, a silvery white that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight like moonbeams on water. "What kind of thread is that, Grandma?" She looked up with eyes that held decades of secrets. "This is baptism thread, child, only used once in each generation, for the newest little soul who needs the strongest protection heaven can provide." I felt the hair on my arms stand up. "What do you mean, once in each generation?" Instead of answering directly, she set down her hoop and looked at me with the intensity of someone about to share something precious and dangerous. "Emma, there are things about our family you don't know, things that have been kept safe by women like me for over 100 years. Are you ready to hear them?" The summer crickets seemed to grow quiet, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for her next words. Have you ever stood on the edge of a truth that you knew would change everything? Your great-great-grandmother, Patience Whitmore, was a mountain woman from these very hills. She learned the art of prayer stitching from a Cherokee woman named Mourning Dove back in the 1880s, when such friendships were dangerous but necessary. Grandma's voice took on the cadence of someone sharing sacred history. Patience's first baby died of fever when he was just 6 months old. She was beside herself with grief, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't bear to go on living. That's when Mourning Dove came to her and taught her that prayers could be sewn into fabric, that protection could be woven with thread, that love could be stitched so tightly that even death couldn't unravel it. The porch swing creaked gently in the evening breeze as Grandma continued. Mourning Dove taught her that certain stitches held certain powers, that colors carried intentions, that the act of creating and unraveling over and over again created a continuous circle of protection that could surround a family like invisible arms. But why unravel them, Grandma? Why not just keep adding to them? Because finished things become fixed, child, static. It's something that's always in the process of becoming, that has the power to grow, to change, to meet whatever challenges come along. I looked down at my sleeping daughter in my arms, this perfect little being who would face a world full of uncertainties, dangers, and heartaches I couldn't even imagine yet. "So you've been protecting us, all of us, with your embroidery?" Me and my mother before me, and her mother before her, an unbroken chain of grandmothers, each one stitching love and protection for the generations that came aft. Have you ever realized that invisible hands have been guiding your life all along? But then Grandma's expression changed, becoming troubled in a way I'd never seen before. "There's something else, Emma, something I've been dreading to tell you." My heart clenched. "What is it, Grandma?" "I'm getting old, child. My eyes aren't what they used to be. My hands shake sometimes, and there are days when I can barely see to thread a needle. The tradition has to be passed on, or it dies with me." She reached for a small wooden chest that sat beside her sewing basket, a chest I'd seen 1,000 times but never really noticed. Everything you need to know is in here. The journal with all the family records, the special threads, the pattern book that's been passed down through 5 generations. But Emma, her voice grew urgent, you have to promise me something. Anything, Grandma. If something happens to me before Sarah is old enough to be protected by her own understanding of the world, you have to take over immediately. The protection can't lapse, not even for a day. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean, if something happens to you? You're healthy as a horse, Grandma. She just smiled that sad, knowing smile I'd seen so many times. Child, I'm 86 years old. The good Lord has blessed me with more time than most folks get. But my time for keeping the family safe is nearly over. It's your turn now. Little did I know that within 6 months, I'd be testing everything Grandma had tried to teach me, and that the true power of her unfinished prayers would be revealed in ways more dramatic and terrifying than I could have ever imagined. Have you ever felt the weight of a responsibility you weren't sure you were strong enough to carry? 3 months after that conversation with Grandma Evelyn, my world fell apart in the span of a single phone call. It was a Tuesday morning in October. I was in my kitchen in Nashville, feeding 9-month-old Sarah her breakfast, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was my Aunt Dorothy, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand her words. Emma, honey, you need to come home right away. It's your grandmother. She's had a stroke. The ceramic bowl of baby food slipped from my hands and shattered on the kitchen floor, sending pureed peaches across my shoes. But I barely noticed. All I could think was, the embroidery, the protection. What happens now? Have you ever felt your safety net disappear in an instant? I threw some clothes in a bag, strapped Sarah into her car seat, and drove the 2 hours to Cedar Springs in a fog of panic and prayer. At the hospital, I found our entire family gathered in the waiting room. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all wearing the same expression of stunned disbelief. How is she? I asked Uncle Robert, Grandma's youngest son. It was a massive stroke, Emma. She's alive, but he struggled to find the words. The doctors don't know if she'll ever wake up. I felt the floor seem to tilt beneath my feet. My daughter gurgled happily in my arms, completely unaware that the invisible shield that had protected our family for generations might be dying in the room down the hall. That first night, I stayed at Grandma's house. I couldn't bear to sleep in her bedroom, so I made up a bed on the living room couch. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself drawn to the front porch, to her empty rocking chair, to the small wooden chest she'd shown me just months before. With trembling hands, I opened the chest for the first time. Inside, I found treasures that took my breath away. Threads of every color imaginable, some so old they felt like silk whispers between my fingers. Needles of different sizes, some obviously handmade. And at the bottom, wrapped in faded blue velvet, a leather journal with pages so delicate, I was afraid they might crumble at my touch. Do you remember the first time you held something that connected you to generations of your ancestors? I opened the journal by lamplight, and what I found made me understand that everything Grandma had told me was not only true, it was far more powerful and urgent than I'd realized. The entries went back over a century, written in different hands, different inks, different generations of women who had carried this sacred responsibility. March 15th, 1887. Patience Whitmore. Little William had the croup. Embroidered his name, June 3rd, 1923, Mary Whitmore. Stock market troubles affecting the family. Used golden thread and prosperity stitches for 3 full moons. Robert's job came through. December 1st, 1952, Ruth Collins. Emma's daddy overseas in the war. Special protection pattern every day until he comes home safe. Page after page of crises met with needle and thread, of dangers averted by patient hands and believing hearts. And then I found the most recent entries, all in Grandma Evelyn's familiar handwriting. August 12th, 1987. Emma's new baby, Sarah. Started baptism embroidery with moonbeam thread. Must be extra careful, danger approaching the family. My hands began shaking as I read those last words. Danger approaching the family. What danger? And how could Grandma have known? I kept reading, growing more alarmed with each entry. September 30th, 1987. The shadow is getting closer. Working day and night on protection patterns. Sarah must be kept safe. October 15th, 1987. Can't shake the feeling that something terrible is coming. Hands shaking too much to stitch properly. Pray Emma is ready to take over. The final entry was dated just 2 days before Grandma's stroke. October 28th, 1987. The danger is here. Can feel it like a storm approaching. Finished the emergency protection pattern for Sarah. Hidden it in the secret compartment. If something happens to me, Emma must find it immediately. Time is running out. Have you ever realized that someone you loved was trying to save you from something you couldn't even see coming? I tore through the chest, looking for this secret compartment Grandma had mentioned. Finally, I found a small panel in the bottom that slid away to reveal a hidden space. Inside was a tiny piece of embroidery, no bigger than a coaster, worked with that silvery moonbeam thread Grandma had been using. It was unlike anything I'd seen before. Instead of prairie roses, this piece showed what looked like angels' wings, stitched so intricately they seemed to move in the lamplight, and woven throughout the wings, in letters so small I needed Grandma's magnifying glass to read them, was a single word repeated over and over: Sarah. I was still studying the embroidery when the phone rang at 3 a.m. It was the hospital. Grandma had taken a turn for the worse. By the time I got there with Sarah, she was gone. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral preparations, family gatherings, and well-meaning casseroles. But underneath the grief, I carried a growing sense of urgency that I couldn't explain. Something was wrong, something was coming, and I was the only one who could protect my daughter from it. The answer came on the day of Grandma's funeral. We'd just returned from the cemetery when my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, called with news that made my blood run cold. There had been an outbreak of meningitis at the Nashville daycare where I'd planned to start taking Sarah the following week. 3 babies were in critical condition. 1 had already died. If Grandma's stroke hadn't brought me home to Cedar Springs, if I hadn't changed my plans, if I'd taken Sarah to that daycare as scheduled, she would have been exposed to a disease that could have killed her in a matter of hours. I stood there holding the phone, looking down at my healthy, happy daughter, and finally understood what Grandma had been trying to tell me. The embroidery wasn't just tradition. It wasn't just comfort for grieving grandmothers. It was real. It worked. And now it was my responsibility. But here's what terrified me. I didn't know how to do it. I'd watched Grandma for years, but I'd never learned the actual stitches, never understood the meanings behind the colors, never practiced the art of turning love into thread and thread into protection. Have you ever faced a responsibility that seemed impossible, but you had no choice but to try? That night, I sat on Grandma's porch with her embroidery hoop in my lap, the journal open beside me, and Sarah sleeping peacefully in her carrier. I picked up a needle with hands that shook like leaves in a storm and attempted my first stitch. It was crooked, uneven, nothing like the perfect work I'd watched Grandma create for so many years. But as I worked, something strange happened. My hands began to steady. The stitches became more even, and deep in my heart, I felt a presence guiding my fingers, showing me the way. It was then I realized that Grandma Evelyn's greatest gift hadn't been her perfect embroidery. It had been preparing me, without my even knowing it, to carry on a tradition that could mean the difference between life and death for the people I loved most. But the real test was yet to come. Do you believe that love can reach across the grave to protect the ones left behind? Learning to embroider prayers isn't something you can pick up from a book or a YouTube tutorial. It's something that has to be felt in your bones, understood in your heart, and guided by hands that have been touched by generations of loving women. Those first few weeks after Grandma's funeral were the hardest of my life. I moved back to Cedar Springs temporarily, staying in Grandma's house while I tried to learn what she'd spent 70 years perfecting. Sarah and I would sit on the porch each evening, her playing with soft toys, while I struggled to master stitches that looked simple but held mysteries I was only beginning to understand. The journal became my Bible, but reading about the techniques and actually performing them were two entirely different things. My fingers would cramp, my eyes would strain, and more often than not, I'd end up picking out more stitches than I managed to complete. Have you ever felt like you were trying to learn a language that everyone else in your family spoke fluently? But slowly, something magical began to happen. As I worked with Grandma's threads and needles, following the faded diagrams in the journal, I started to feel connected to something larger than myself. It was as if all the women who had come before me were guiding my hands, whispering instructions I couldn't quite hear, but somehow understood. The first real lesson came when I found a letter tucked between the journal pages, written in Grandma's hand and addressed to me. My dear Emma, if you're reading this, it means the responsibility has passed to you sooner than we both hoped. Don't be afraid, child. You carry the wisdom of 5 generations of women in your blood. Trust your instincts, trust your heart, and remember, it's not about perfect stitches. It's about perfect love. Perfect love. I held on to those words like a lifeline as I struggled through my early attempts. The first crisis came when my brother Jake called to tell me his 5-year-old son Tommy had been diagnosed with leukemia. I felt that familiar panic rise in my chest, the same feeling I'd had when I learned about Grandma's stroke. But this time, instead of feeling helpless, I knew what I had to do. I spent 3 days and nights embroidering Tommy's name, using what the journal called healing stitches, a complex pattern that required me to work in complete silence, stitching only during the hours between midnight and dawn. I called it proof that Grandma's tradition was now mine to carry. Do you know the feeling of discovering you have a power you never knew existed? Over the following months, I threw myself into learning everything the journal could teach me. I discovered that different times of day carried different energies. Dawn stitches for new beginnings, noon stitches for strength and courage, sunset stitches for peace and healing, midnight stitches for protection against darkness. I learned that the phases of the moon mattered too. New moon embroidery for fresh starts, full moon work for maximum power, waning moon stitches for removing obstacles or illness from someone's life. The colors, I found out, were even more specific than Grandma had told me. White for healing and purification. But not just any white. It had to be cotton thread, blessed under the full moon. Red for courage and strength, but bright red for physical courage, deep red for emotional strength, and pale pink for matters of the heart. Gold thread was for prosperity and success, but it had to be real gold thread, not just yellow. Silver for intuition and psychic protection. Green for growth and new opportunities, but different shades for different needs. Bright green for financial growth. But the most important lesson I learned was about intention. As Grandma had tried to tell me, perfect technique meant nothing without perfect love. The stitches had to be made with complete focus on the person you were trying to help, complete faith that your prayers would be answered, and complete willingness to sacrifice your own time and energy for their well-being. It was exhausting work, both physically and emotionally. There were nights when I'd sit on that porch until dawn, stitching and restitching the same pattern, praying and hoping and pouring everything I had into those tiny threads. But it worked. Time and again, it worked. When my cousin Rebecca's husband was laid off from his job, I embroidered his name with golden prosperity thread during a full moon. He found a better position within 2 weeks. When my Aunt Dorothy's arthritis got so bad she could barely walk, I spent 7 nights stitching her name with silver healing thread. Her next doctor's appointment showed improvement the physicians couldn't explain. When my old high school friend called to tell me her teenage daughter was using drugs and running with a dangerous crowd, I worked for a month with that deep forest green thread Grandma used for lost people. Within 6 weeks, the girl had voluntarily entered rehab and was working to rebuild her relationship with her family. Each success strengthened my faith and deepened my understanding of the responsibility I'd inherited. But it also made me realize something that both thrilled and terrified me. This wasn't just about helping my immediate family anymore. Word was spreading quietly through the community about the woman who could stitch prayers for people in need. Do you believe that some gifts are meant to be shared, even when sharing them changes your entire life? People began showing up at my door, not just family, but neighbors, friends of friends, sometimes complete strangers who had heard whispers about a woman in Cedar Springs who could help when everything else had failed. I helped them all, How could I not? When a mother came to me crying because her son was deployed in a dangerous part of the world, could I turn her away? When an elderly man asked me to stitch prayers for his wife who was dying of cancer, could I say no? But with each new person I tried to help, I felt the weight of the tradition growing heavier on my shoulders. I began to understand why Grandma had always looked so tired in those final years, why her hands had shaken when she thought no one was looking. This gift, this curse, this sacred responsibility was bigger than any one person should have to carry alone. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to teach Sarah to embroider, just as Grandma had taught me to watch and learn. Even if she was still just a toddler, even if she couldn't understand the significance yet, I was going to make sure this tradition had a future. Because I'd learned something that Grandma perhaps hadn't realized when she started training me. This power was too important to rest in the hands of just one woman. It needed to be shared, nurtured, passed on, not just to the next generation, but to anyone who had the heart to handle it responsibly. Have you ever realized that your greatest challenge was actually your greatest opportunity to serve others? The ultimate test of everything I'd learned came when Sarah was 3 years old, and it nearly broke my faith forever. It started on a beautiful spring morning. Sarah was playing in the backyard, laughing as she chased butterflies through Grandma's old flower garden. I was on the porch, working on a protection embroidery for a neighbor's grandson who was struggling in school, when I heard a sound that every parent dreads. Sudden silence where there should have been joyful noise. I looked up to see Sarah lying motionless beside the old stone well that Grandpa Thomas had covered with heavy boards decades ago. Somehow, one of the boards had rotted through, and she had fallen partially through the opening. Have you ever had a moment when time seemed to stop and your heart forgot how to beat? I ran to her faster than I'd ever moved in my life, calling her name, praying she was just stuck and scared, not seriously hurt. But when I reached her, my worst fears were confirmed. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow, and there was blood on the stones around the well opening. The ambulance took forever to arrive, or maybe it just felt like forever, when every second stretched into eternity. As the paramedics worked on my daughter, I found myself making bargains with God, promising anything, everything, if He would just let her be okay. At the hospital, the news was devastating. Sarah had suffered a severe head injury and was in a coma. The doctors couldn't tell us if she would wake up, and if she did, whether she'd be the same bright, laughing child who had been chasing butterflies just hours before. I sat beside her hospital bed that first night, holding her small hand, watching machines monitor her vital signs, feeling more helpless than I'd ever felt in my life. This was my daughter, my baby, the child I'd spent 3 years protecting with every prayer I could stitch into fabric. Where were the guardian angels now? Where was the protection that was supposed to surround our family like invisible armor? Do you know the anguish of questioning everything you believe in when faced with the unthinkable? It was then that I remembered Grandma's final embroidery, the tiny piece with angel wings and Sarah's name that I'd found in the secret compartment. In my grief and panic, I'd left it at home. But something deep inside me whispered that I needed it now more than ever. I called my neighbor and asked her to bring it to the hospital. When she arrived with that small piece of moonbeam thread and intricate stitching, I placed it under Sarah's pillow and began to pray with an intensity I'd never experienced before. But I didn't just pray with words. I pulled out the small embroidery kit I'd started carrying everywhere and began to stitch right there in that sterile hospital room. I stitched Sarah's name in every pattern I'd learned, using every color that represented healing, protection, and divine intervention. The nurses thought I was having a breakdown. The doctors suggested I go home and rest, but I couldn't leave. I wouldn't leave. I sat in that uncomfortable hospital chair for 3 days and 3 nights, stitching continuously, my fingers raw and bleeding, my eyes burning from exhaustion and tears. Have you ever poured your entire soul into something, knowing it might be your last chance to save what matters most? On the morning of the 4th day, something extraordinary happened. I was working on what I'd decided would be my final attempt, a complex pattern combining every protective stitch Grandma had ever taught me, when Sarah's fingers moved. At first, I thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion, but then her eyes fluttered open, and she looked directly at me with the same bright, curious expression she'd had before the accident. "Mama," she whispered, her voice small but clear, "I dreamed about angels. They had silver wings just like your embroidery." The doctors called it a miracle. They'd been preparing us for the possibility that Sarah might never wake up, or if she did, that she might have severe brain damage. Instead, within a week, she was completely back to normal, running, laughing, chattering nonstop about everything she wanted to do. But here's what truly convinced me that Grandma's tradition was more powerful than I'd ever imagined. When the doctors did their final brain scans before discharging Sarah, they found something that made them scratch their heads in confusion. The injury that had shown up so clearly on the initial scans, the swelling, the damaged tissue, the areas of concern, had completely healed. Not just healed, but healed in a way that left no scar tissue, no lingering damage, nothing to suggest she'd ever been injured at all. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, her doctor told me, and I've never seen anything like this. It's as if the injury never happened. But I knew it had happened, and I knew what had healed it. Do you believe that some miracles come disguised as ordinary love, sewn into fabric by faithful hands?" That experience changed everything for me. I was no longer just continuing a family tradition. I was carrying on a sacred trust that had the power to literally save lives. But it also made me realize something important. This gift was too precious to keep hidden, too powerful to be practiced by just one person. When we got home from the hospital, I made a decision that would have shocked Grandma Evelyn, but that I knew in my heart was right. I began teaching other women in Cedar Springs the art of prayer embroidery. I started with my sister-in-law Janet, who had always been handy with crafts. Then my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, whose grandmother had practiced something similar in Mexico. Soon, word spread quietly through the community, and I had a small group of women meeting in my living room every Tuesday evening. I taught them everything Grandma had taught me: the meanings behind the colors, the power of different stitches, the importance of intention and faith. But most importantly, I taught them that this wasn't about superstition or magic tricks. It was about channeling love so pure and focused that it could move mountains, heal bodies, and protect families. Some of the women took to it naturally, their stitches flowing with the same rhythm I remembered from watching Grandma. Others struggled with the techniques, but made up for it with the intensity of their devotion to the people they were trying to help. And it worked. Story after story came back to our little circle of women who had found a way to turn their deepest love into tangible protection for their families. Mrs. Rodriguez's son, who had been struggling with addiction, finally entered rehab successfully. Janet's husband's small business, which had been failing for months, suddenly started thriving. The pastor's wife, whose marriage had been in crisis, found her way back to love and forgiveness. Were these coincidences? Maybe. But when the same coincidences happened again and again, week after week, for family after family, I knew we were witnessing something far more profound than chance. Have you ever been part of something that made you feel connected to every loving woman who came before you? Today, 15 years after that terrifying night in the hospital, Sarah is 18 years old and heading to college in the fall. She's healthy, brilliant, and completely aware of the tradition that helped save her life. More importantly, she's already learning to embroider her own prayers. Last week, she came to me with news that made my heart both sing and ache. Her best friend, Katie, had been diagnosed with depression and is talking about hurting herself. Without being asked, without any prompting from me, Sarah had spent 3 nights stitching Katie's name with the pale blue thread we use for emotional healing and protection. "I know it sounds crazy, Mom," she said, showing me her work, but I could feel Grandma Evelyn guiding my hands. And Katie called this morning to say she's decided to get help instead of doing something terrible. I looked at my daughter's embroidery, the stitches slightly uneven, but filled with such love and hope, and saw the future of our tradition secured in her capable hands. The circle of women who gather in my living room has grown to include more than 20 members now. We come from different backgrounds, different faiths, different walks of life, but we're united by our belief that love can be transformed into protection, that prayers can be sewn into fabric, and that the simple act of caring for others can create miracles. We keep detailed records, just as Grandma did, documenting every prayer request, every embroidery project, every answered prayer. The evidence is overwhelming. Something profound and beautiful happens when women gather together to focus their love and faith on helping others. But here's what I've learned that's perhaps most important of all. This tradition isn't really about the embroidery. It's not about perfect stitches or special threads or secret patterns passed down through generations. It's about the willingness to sit quietly, focus your heart completely on someone you love, and pour every ounce of your faith and hope into the belief that your love can make a difference in their life. The embroidery is just a way to channel that love, to give it form and substance, to create something tangible that represents the intangible power of a heart that refuses to give up on the people it loves. Do you have someone in your life who deserves that kind of focused, patient, unwavering love? Grandma Evelyn's rocking chair still sits on my front porch. And sometimes in the evenings, I sit there with my own embroidery hoop, working on prayers for the people who need them most. Sarah often joins me And now my 8-year-old niece Emma has started learning the basic stitches too. 5 generations of women, connected by thread and faith, and the unshakable belief that love is the most powerful force in the universe. Sometimes tourists driving through Cedar Springs stop to ask about the women they see sitting on porches throughout the town, working on their embroidery as the sun sets behind the mountains. We just smile and tell them it's an old tradition, a way to keep our hands busy and our hearts peaceful. We don't tell them about the miracles. We don't explain about the prayers sewn into every stitch. We don't mention the healing that happens when love is transformed into thread, and thread is transformed into protection. Some secrets are too sacred to share with strangers, but they're not too sacred to share with family, with neighbors, with anyone who has a heart open enough to believe that ordinary love can accomplish extraordinary things. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone who might need to know that miracles still happen in quiet places, created by patient hands and faithful hearts. And next week, I'll tell you about the mysterious wooden box that appeared on my porch one morning, and what I found inside that connected me to a family I never knew existed. Subscribe to our channel for stories that remind us that we're surrounded by miracles every day. We just need to know how to recognize them. What prayer would you stitch into fabric if you believed it could protect someone you love? Because here's the truth. I've learned from a lifetime of watching faithful women work small miracles with needle and thread. Every act of love, no matter how simple it might seem, has the power to change the world one stitch at a time.